The Panther tank was supposed to be the answer to everything. When the first prototype rolled out of the factory floor in early 1943, the German officers gathered to witness it were filled with awe. Its lines were sleek, its armor sloped perfectly to deflect shells, and its 75 millimeter high-velocity gun promised to cut through Allied and Soviet tanks like paper. To many, it was a machine born from pure genius, the embodiment of German engineering perfection. But within minutes of testing, that illusion began to crack. The day was hot, even for a German summer. Dust clung to the metal as the massive V12 Maybach engine roared to life. The officers watched as the tank rumbled across the test field, its treads crushing the earth beneath it. At first, everything looked flawless. The Panther glided forward, its suspension smooth, its engine powerful. Yet inside the hull, the temperature began to rise, fast. Engineers in field uniforms wiped sweat from their foreheads as they tracked the gauges. Oil temperature, coolant pressure, fuel mixture, all climbing dangerously. The roar of the engine deepened, then began to choke. Within minutes, smoke poured from the rear vents. The mighty machine that was meant to crush the T-34 was sputtering before it had even left the test ground. The officers standing nearby exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen mechanical failures before. Every new tank had its flaws. But this was different. The Panther wasn't just a new design. It was a desperate gamble. After the shock of facing Soviet T-34s on the Eastern Front in 1941, Hitler himself had demanded a superior tank that could match their mobility and surpass their firepower. The result was rushed, massive, and untested. As the Panther's engine smoked, mechanics rushed forward, opening hatches and shouting for tools. The heat pouring from the engine compartment was unbearable. The radiators had failed to circulate properly, the water pumps couldn't keep pace, and the oil seals began to melt. What had been a demonstration of power turned into a lesson in overconfidence. Still, the officers didn't abandon hope. The tank was too important. It represented the future of Germany's armored divisions. Sleek, deadly, invincible in theory. They told the engineers to make it work, no matter what it took. In their minds, it wasn't the design that was at fault. It was the execution. They would fix the flaws, reinforce the cooling systems, and prepare it for the coming war in the East. But the cracks were already too deep. In the following days, more tests were conducted. Each one revealed new problems. Engines seizing, transmissions breaking, drive wheels shattering under pressure. The Panther's power came at a cost. It was too heavy for its engine, too complex for its supply lines, and too fragile for the brutal conditions of the front. Yet despite all of this, the German high command pressed on. There was no turning back. The invasion of Kursk was approaching, and the Panther was to make its debut there. 1,000 of them, the pride of the Wehrmacht, lined up for what would become the largest tank battle in history. None of the officers who watched that first test could have imagined the nightmare that was coming. The Panther would burn through engines faster than they could be replaced. It would break down in the field before even reaching battle. Its tracks would jam, its transmission would overheat, and its fuel consumption would cripple entire divisions. The perfection they had dreamed of was collapsing under the weight of reality. Still, they believed. They had to. In 1943, belief was the only thing Germany had left to fight with. The first shipment of Panthers rolled toward the Eastern Front in early summer 1943, freshly painted, shining under the weak German sun. They looked magnificent. Broad hulls, long guns, sloped armor glinting in the light. Soldiers stopped to stare as the convoys passed through villages, convinced they were witnessing the birth of a new era in armored warfare. Posters and propaganda called the Panther a Panzer Revolution, a machine that would restore dominance on the battlefield. But the men who drove them knew better. Even before reaching the front, the engines groaned. Mechanics rode with each column, working constantly to fix overheating engines and leaking fuel lines. The Maybach HL-230 engine, powerful in theory, ran at the edge of its limits under the tank's 45-ton weight. Cooling systems struggled, oil pumps failed, and cracks formed in the final drives. On the long road east, smoke trailed behind several tanks as mechanics battled to keep them alive. Many Panthers broke down before ever seeing combat. Spare parts were scarce, the logistics nightmare. Crews began to carry extra oil and coolant inside the fighting compartment, knowing that every kilometer could be their last before another breakdown. When the surviving tanks finally reached the staging grounds near Kursk, they stood as towering beasts among older Panzer IIIs and IVs. The contrast was shocking. The Panther looked invincible beside its predecessors. Its 75mm KWK-42 gun could destroy a T-34 from 2 kilometers away. Its armor could shrug off most Soviet shells. On paper, it was perfect. On the ground, it was already fragile. As preparations for Operation Citadel began, officers reported hundreds of minor faults. Engines overheated during idle. Transmissions locked during turns. The narrow tracks dug into the soft Russian earth, causing the massive vehicles to bog down. Mechanics worked day and night, patching, welding, improvising. Engineers back in Germany sent frantic updates, replace seals, improve filters, widen the cooling ducts. But time had run out. The offensive was imminent. On July 5, 1943, the Battle of Kursk began. The largest armored clash in history was underway. Hundreds of Panthers roared to life, filling the morning air with smoke and thunder. The German officers watching from behind the lines felt a surge of confidence. Here, finally, was the machine that would change everything. That confidence lasted minutes. Within the first hour of battle, the mechanical flaws became catastrophic. Engines burst into flames, transmissions jammed, and radiators failed. Panthers that hadn't even reached enemy lines were immobilized by heat. Mechanics risked their lives under artillery fire to cool engines and restart dead machines. The very design that had promised superiority was betraying them in the field. Yet even broken, the Panther was terrifying. Those that remained operational tore through Soviet armor with devastating precision. A single well-positioned Panther could destroy multiple T-34s before they closed the distance. Soviet reports described shells bouncing harmlessly off the sloped armor. But every minute the tanks stayed in motion, their engines crept closer to destruction. The Germans pushed forward, slowly, painfully, leaving a trail of burning Panthers behind. The battlefield became a graveyard of half-melted steel and scorched earth. The officers at headquarters were silent as reports came in. Dozens of tanks lost not to enemy fire, but to heat, friction, and failure. Still, the order came: advance, no matter the cost. By nightfall, the first day of battle had turned triumph into disaster. Of nearly 200 Panthers deployed in the opening assault, more than half were out of action. Not destroyed by the enemy, but crippled by their own engineering. The officers could hardly believe it. The tank that was supposed to dominate the war had barely survived its first test. The Panther's strength was undeniable, but its weakness, the beating heart of its design, had already doomed it, and the war was only halfway through. The second day at Kursk dawned beneath a heavy haze of smoke and dust. The fields were scorched black, the air thick with the stench of fuel and burning metal. Across the front, hundreds of German tanks stood crippled, silent hulks surrounded by twisted treads and shattered wheels. Among them, the Panthers looked like fallen giants, their once proud silhouettes now bent and lifeless against the horizon. Of the 200 Panthers that had rolled into battle on the first day, only a few dozen remained mobile. Mechanics worked feverishly through the night, using scavenged parts and salvaged oil to bring the machines back to life. They crawled beneath the tanks while artillery shells thundered in the distance, hands blistered and blackened from heat. Each repair was a gamble. A new belt might last an hour. A patch on a cracked radiator might hold for half a day, or fail in minutes. For the officers overseeing the repair yards, it was a grim revelation. The Panther's problem was not its firepower or its armor. It was its heart. The Maybach engines, forced to push 45 tons of steel across the battlefield, simply could not endure. In test conditions, they ran hot. In the dust and chaos of Russia, they burned. Still, the Germans refused to accept defeat. Each working Panther was too valuable to lose. Crews were rotated, replacements drafted, spare parts raided from damaged tanks. By noon, 40 operational Panthers were ready to rejoin the assault. Their orders were simple: push deeper toward the Soviet lines, link up with the Tiger battalions, and punch through the Red Army defenses. The ground trembled as the Panthers advanced again. Through the smoke, they looked unstoppable, lines of massive tanks moving in formation, guns pointed toward the horizon. Soviet gunners opened fire from hidden positions, their shells glancing off the Panther's sloped armor. The Germans returned fire with brutal precision, their 75 millimeter guns tearing through waves of T-34s and anti-tank positions. For a brief moment, the officers watching from command posts believed the tide had turned. The Panthers cut a path straight through the Soviet line, leaving burning wrecks in their wake. German propaganda officers later described it as a storm of steel that could not be broken. But deep inside the tanks, the same old battle was raging, the fight against heat. Engines screamed under strain, coolant gauges spiked. The transmission housings glowed red hot. The smell of burning oil filled the interiors. One by one, the Panthers began to falter again. Their engines coughed, sputtered, then died. Crews bailed out, cursing and drenched in sweat. In the middle of the greatest tank battle in history, Germany's most advanced war machine was losing not to the enemy, but to its own design. By the end of the second day, the scene was devastating. The battlefield was a checkerboard of burning Soviet wrecks and smoldering German tanks. The Panthers had proven their lethality and their fragility. Out of 40 that had advanced that morning, only 10 were still operational by nightfall. Commanders sent back urgent reports. Engines overheating, cooling systems failing, transmission seizing under load. The engineers in Germany read the messages with disbelief. They had warned of these issues months earlier, but production pressures had overridden their concerns. Hitler had demanded the Panther be ready for Kursk, no matter the cost. Now that cost was clear. The officers at the front could only watch as mechanics towed disabled tanks back from the line, engines still smoking. The Panther's debut, intended to be a triumph of German engineering, had become a symbol of its desperation. Still, in the chaos of Kursk, even the broken Panthers played their part. Their hulks became cover for infantry, their guns used as stationary fortresses. The machine had failed, but the men refused to. As the third night fell, the sound of distant fighting echoed through the darkness. The officers gathered around their maps, the flickering lanterns casting long shadows. They marked every tank lost, every kilometer gained. It was a map painted in steel, oil, and fire. They still hoped the Panther could be redeemed. But deep down, some already knew the truth. No matter how advanced the machine, it could not survive a war it wasn't built for. The fourth day of Kursk began under a sunless sky, where black columns of smoke rose like pillars from the horizon. The battlefield had become a landscape of wreckage. Endless carcasses of tanks, shattered artillery, and the remains of soldiers and machines fused together by fire. The Panthers, once heralded as the future of armored warfare, stood scattered across the steppe, many abandoned or half-buried in mud. For the German officers overseeing the chaos, the reality was now undeniable. Of the hundreds of Panthers deployed, barely a fraction remained combat-ready. Yet Hitler's orders were absolute. They were to push forward, no matter the losses. The Panther was to prove its worth, or die trying. Mechanics worked tirelessly through the night to revive the crippled machines. They cannibalized destroyed tanks, stripping engines, fuel pumps, and radiators from burned-out hulks to keep others alive. Field workshops were set up under the cover of darkness, welding sparks glowing like fireflies in the smoke. Every functioning Panther that rolled out before dawn was treated as a miracle. By morning, the survivors prepared to move again. Their armor was scorched, their engines coughing smoke, but they moved. The officers rode alongside, watching as the tanks rumbled forward across the cratered plain. The sound was deafening, a deep mechanical growl mixed with the roar of artillery. The German advance met fierce resistance. Soviet anti-tank guns had learned where to aim. They no longer fired at the thick-sloped armor, but at the lower hulls and engine decks, exploiting the Panther's weakest points. Each hit sent fountains of dirt and fire into the air. Still, the Panthers pressed on, their guns blazing. But even when the enemy missed, the tanks were fighting themselves. Inside, temperatures soared above 50 degrees Celsius. Sweat dripped from every surface, steam hissing from the radiators. The crews endured the heat in silence, faces pale under the flicker of warning lights. The Maybach engines strained, their roar turning hoarse as metal expanded and bearings screamed. One by one, the tanks began to drop out. A seized transmission here, a burst coolant pipe there. Mechanics followed behind in trucks, trying to revive them under fire. Some tanks caught fire spontaneously, their fuel lines rupturing from the heat. The smell of burning oil and rubber spread across the fields. By noon, the advance had stalled again. The German officers stood in disbelief, binoculars in hand, watching as their prized machines ground to a halt in clouds of steam. The Panther had the armor of a fortress and the gun of a god, but the heart of a machine that couldn't breathe. Reports poured in from across the front: overheating, fuel leaks, electrical fires. Even the Tigers, though slower, were proving more reliable in the heat. The Panther, designed to be Germany's next step in armored evolution, had instead become its Achilles heel. At headquarters, engineers pored over the reports, their pencils scratching furiously across blueprints. They proposed solutions: improved gaskets, stronger cooling fans, reinforced transmissions. But none of it could help the men fighting now. The tanks on the field were beyond repair. They were victims of their own ambition. That night, as the exhausted mechanics sat among the wrecks, the truth was impossible to ignore. The Panther was not a weapon of endurance, it was a weapon of promise. Built too quickly, tested too little, and burdened by perfectionism, it had failed its first great test. And yet, in its failure, it had revealed something remarkable. Even crippled, even broken, it terrified its enemies. Soviet tank crews reported the mere sight of its silhouette was enough to halt entire advances. The Germans took what comfort they could in that, but as dawn approached once more, the officers knew fear and reputation were not enough. Machines could not win wars if they could not endure them. The Panther was powerful, but fragile, brilliant, but flawed. And as the fires of Kursk burned into the horizon, that contradiction became the story of Germany's war itself. By the fifth day of the Battle of Kursk, the sound of engines had faded into the background hum of distant artillery. The once confident march of German armor had slowed to a crawl. The fields that had seen thousands of tons of steel roll forward now resembled a scrapyard of destruction: twisted metal, ruptured hulls, and the acrid stench of burned fuel. Among the wrecks, the Panther stood as both marvel and failure. Its shape was beautiful in a terrible way. Sloped armor catching the dull light of a gray dawn, its long barrel still aimed toward the enemy that had long since vanished from view. The officers walking among the destroyed tanks couldn't help but admire it, even as they cursed the flaws that had doomed it. What had been envisioned as the most advanced fighting machine in the world had proven too delicate for war. Of the hundreds of Panthers sent to Kursk, nearly two-thirds were disabled within a week. Not by enemy fire, but by the battlefield itself. Engines that should have roared for hours seized in minutes. Radiators clogged with dust and mud. Fuel pumps overheated, catching fire under the strain. Still, the Germans refused to give up. The officers at the front sent desperate messages back to the factories in Germany, demanding immediate fixes. Engineers responded with urgency, drafting plans for improved cooling systems, better filters, and reinforced transmissions. But the solutions were weeks away. The front could not wait. The surviving Panther crews became part mechanic, part soldier. They learned to fight with one hand and repair with the other. Engines were cooled with buckets of water stolen from wells. Holes in the armor were patched with scavenged steel. Tanks that couldn't move were dug into the ground and turned into stationary fortresses, their guns serving as defensive artillery. The men adapted because they had no other choice. As the German lines contracted and the offensive faltered, the officers began to see the full scope of the disaster. Kursk had not just been a failed offensive. It was the breaking point of German armored supremacy. The Allies and Soviets now knew that the invincible Panther was not invincible at all. It could destroy anything it hit, but it could not keep itself alive. The consequences rippled far beyond the battlefield. In Berlin, Hitler demanded reports. He wanted explanations, not excuses. How could his most advanced weapon, a machine built from the finest engineers and factories in Europe, fail so spectacularly? The generals blamed rushed production. The engineers blamed impossible deadlines. But the truth was simpler. Perfection had been demanded in a world that no longer allowed it. On the front, the officers learned to hide their frustration behind stoicism. They still spoke of the Panther's potential, still called it a masterpiece in progress. They knew the propaganda machine depended on it, yet privately they called it what it was, a weapon that consumed its own army faster than it destroyed the enemy. The days dragged on, each one the same. Repair, fight, overheat, retreat. The German advance had turned to defense. Kursk was lost. The Panther's debut, meant to symbolize German invincibility, had instead exposed its limits. As the officers surveyed the wreckage, a strange quiet settled over the battlefield. The Soviets were advancing again, cautiously, methodically, knowing that the German armored divisions were bleeding out. The Panther crews stood beside their crippled machines, watching the horizon glow with artillery fire. They had given everything, time, skill, hope, to keep their machines alive. But war demanded more than brilliance. It demanded endurance. That night, a cold rain began to fall, hissing softly over the still-burning tanks. The water mixed with oil and ash, forming rivers of black mud that ran through the craters and trenches. The officers stood beneath the downpour, faces streaked with soot, staring at what was left of their armored dream. In that silence, they understood something profound. Technology alone could not win the war. It could dazzle, it could terrify, but it could not save them. The Panther had been born of genius, but also of arrogance. And arrogance, like steel under heat, eventually bends and breaks. When the survivors finally pulled back from Kursk, the once mighty armored spearhead of Germany looked nothing like the vision its generals had imagined. The fields behind them were littered with blackened husks of Panthers, each one a monument to overreach. Mechanics and recovery crews followed the retreat, towing away anything that could still be salvaged. In some areas, entire battalions had been reduced to a handful of functioning machines. The officers who remained at the front were grim and silent. Their optimism, once fired by the promise of a superweapon, had vanished in the choking dust of reality. The Panther had been meant to change the course of the war. Instead, it had revealed how far Germany's reach had exceeded its grasp. The machine's brilliance, its perfect armor geometry, its high-velocity gun, had been undermined by its fragility. Every battle was a contest not only against the enemy, but against the Panther's own limits. When the first trains of crippled Panthers arrived back in Germany for overhaul, the engineers gathered to inspect them. What they saw stunned them. Engines melted from heat, transmissions cracked clean through, drive wheels shattered, and electrical systems corroded by constant exposure to oil and smoke. Each tank was a puzzle of destruction, some burned beyond recognition, others still smelling of scorched paint and fuel. In the factories, engineers dissected their creation piece by piece. They logged every failure, every weakness. The cooling system was redesigned with improved radiators and new fans. The transmission received stronger gears and better lubrication. Welding seams were thickened, filters improved. Dozens of modifications were planned, each one promising to save the machine from its own complexity. But while engineers revised blueprints, the war outside the workshops continued to turn. Germany was now fighting on every front: Italy, the Soviet Union, and soon France. Every improvement made to the Panther came at the cost of time and resources the Reich no longer had. The officers who had fought at Kursk returned home to briefings and inquiries. They spoke plainly. The Panther had potential, yes, but it was unreliable in real conditions. They described how the engines failed, how the transmissions locked, how mud and heat rendered the tank immobile. But to the higher command, those words were unacceptable. The Panther was already part of Germany's myth. To admit its flaws would be to admit weakness. And so, orders were given to continue production. The factories under Allied bombardment churned out more Panthers each month. Crews were trained, new divisions formed, and once again, the machine that had failed in the summer of 1943 was sent back to war. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets had learned from Kursk. Their T-34s no longer charged head-on into German lines. They attacked from the flanks, from forests, from fog. The Panther's long gun gave it reach, but its mechanical heart remained delicate. Even with the modifications, breakdowns continued. Engines still overheated, cooling systems clogged, transmissions jammed. The crews had learned to fight cautiously, never pushing the machine harder than it could bear. In bitter irony, what had been designed as a predator had become a fragile prize. Soviet reports frequently noted Panthers abandoned intact, their engines dead, their crews fleeing under pressure. Entire platoons were lost without a shot fired. Still, when the Panther did fight, it was devastating. A single well-positioned tank could halt a Soviet advance, its 75 mm gun tearing through lines of T-34s before they even saw it. It was both a miracle and a curse, a masterpiece that could win battles and lose wars. The German officers who had once watched the first test now watched their armies retreat. They saw Panthers fighting in the ruins of Kiev, the forests of Poland, and soon the streets of France. Everywhere they performed brilliantly for moments, before heat, exhaustion, or logistics broke them down again. In 1944, reports showed that nearly half of all Panthers lost were not destroyed by the enemy, but abandoned after mechanical failure. The same story repeated itself from one front to another. Overheating, engine fires, seized transmissions. A triumph of design that could never escape its own weakness. For the officers who had once stood proudly at its first demonstration, the irony was cruel. The Panther had been meant to symbolize German perfection. Instead, it had become the perfect symbol of a nation collapsing under its own ambition. By the spring of 1944, the Panther had become a paradox made of steel, feared by enemies, distrusted by its own crews. It was a tank that could dominate the battlefield for minutes, then cripple itself before the fight was over. German officers called it a weapon too perfect for war. Its power was unquestioned, but its reliability remained its curse. Across Europe, the tank's story played out the same way. Brilliance, fire, and failure. In Ukraine, Panthers bogged down in the thawing mud. In Italy, they struggled to climb steep terrain without overheating. In France, they waited, hidden in hedgerows and villages, ready for the Allied invasion they knew was coming. Each crew treated their Panther like a living creature, one that demanded constant care and patience. They learned to idle the engines gently, to keep radiators clean, to ration every drop of coolant. They treated the Maybach like glass, knowing one mistake could leave them stranded. Behind the lines, engineers still worked tirelessly to fix the beast's flaws. They improved seals, adjusted fuel systems, and added larger cooling fans. On paper, the Panther was now better than ever. Faster, stronger, more refined. But every improvement came too late to matter. The tide of war had turned. Germany was no longer dictating the terms of battle. It was struggling to survive them. In May 1944, the first Panthers reached the French countryside. They were assigned to elite SS and Panzer divisions, placed in ambush positions near Normandy's narrow roads and fields. When the Allies landed in June, the Panthers' chance at redemption arrived. Against Shermans, Cromwells, and Churchills, it was unmatched. Its shells tore through Allied armor with ease, often from over a kilometer away. Soldiers who had once cursed their machines now watched in awe as they destroyed columns of advancing tanks. But the same old truth returned within hours. As the battles raged through the hedgerows, the Panthers overheated again. Engines stalled, cooling systems jammed with dust and debris. Tanks that had ambushed successfully were soon immobile, abandoned by their crews as Allied artillery zeroed in. The German officers commanding the defense reported both triumph and tragedy. For every enemy tank destroyed, one Panther was lost to its own flaws. The Allies quickly learned to exploit those weaknesses. They attacked during the heat of the day, when German engines were most likely to fail. They laid smoke screens to force the Panthers to maneuver, straining their transmissions and overheating their engines. What should have been Germany's ultimate weapon became a burden that slowed every movement of the defense. And yet, the myth of the Panther continued to grow. Allied soldiers who faced it spoke with awe and fear. It looked invincible, one American tanker would later recall. We'd see the shot bounce off, and it would turn its gun like it was choosing who died next. For those inside the machine, however, the experience was far different. They felt every rattle, every temperature spike, every trembling gear. They knew that even victory carried risk. that every kilometer driven was another step toward the next failure. By late summer, the German officers at the front understood that the Panther's legend had become detached from its truth. They no longer saw a perfect machine. They saw a desperate compromise, a weapon that demanded more fuel, more parts, more maintenance than Germany could ever provide. The tank that had been meant to save the Reich was now draining it. Still, when a Panther fought, it fought magnificently. In the fields of Villers-Bocage, in the ruins of Caen, in the forests of the Ardennes, it struck terror into Allied lines. Crews spoke of the satisfaction of hitting an enemy tank at long range, of feeling the recoil of the gun, of watching fire bloom on the horizon. For a moment, the machine redeemed itself, but always the same end came. Smoke from the engine, a sudden loss of power, the sound of gears grinding to silence. To the officers who commanded them, the pattern was inescapable. The Panther was both Germany's greatest tank and its most fatal flaw. It was a machine too advanced for a war that no longer had time for perfection. As the summer wore on and the Allies advanced inland, hundreds of Panthers were left behind. Some burned, others simply dead, their engines silent, their crews gone. They stood by the roadsides like memorials to the ambition that had built them. The machine that had once been meant to rule the battlefield was now part of the wreckage left in retreat, and yet, even in defeat, its presence lingered. The Panther's shadow stretched across every battlefield it touched, a reminder that brilliance, when rushed, can become ruin. By autumn of 1944, the Panther had become both legend and liability. To the Allies, it was still the most dangerous tank on the battlefield, a predator that could destroy anything it saw. But to the German officers who commanded them, the truth was bitter. Every kilometer traveled was a risk, every engagement a gamble between victory and self-destruction. The Panther's raw power had never been in question. Its endurance, however, remained its greatest enemy. In the retreat through France, its mechanical frailty was exposed for all to see. The German armored divisions were constantly on the move, falling back toward the Reich, harassed day and night by Allied air power. Fuel shortages crippled mobility, and overheating engines made long marches nearly impossible. Many Panthers were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. Their engines dead, their hulls abandoned on the roadside, their turrets turned to face the sky like monuments to failed ambition. By the time German units regrouped near the Siegfried Line, fewer than half of the Panthers assigned to the Western Front were operational. Those that remained were worn and battered, their paint blackened by smoke, their engines patched together from scavenged parts. Mechanics worked under relentless strain, scavenging components from wrecks and performing miracles just to keep a handful of tanks alive. Still, the Panther refused to disappear quietly. Its presence on the battlefield could turn panic into pride. When it rolled into position, massive, sleek, its long barrel cutting through the mist, even weary infantry straightened their backs. The officers knew it too. They deployed the surviving tanks sparingly, saving them for ambushes, for decisive moments when a single Panther could halt an entire Allied column. As winter crept in, Germany prepared for one last gamble, the Ardennes offensive. In December 1944, hundreds of Panthers were assembled in the forests of Belgium, their engines shrouded in snow and silence. The officers hoped that in the cold air, the overheating problems might finally ease. Perhaps for once, the machine would perform as it had always been meant to. When the attack began, the snow muffled the roar of engines. Panthers rolled through the frozen woods, their camouflage blending perfectly with the landscape. For the first time since Kursk, the offensive seemed to move in Germany's favor. The tanks struck fast and hard, cutting through surprised American units, blasting through fog and snow. The Panther's 75mm guns tore through Sherman tanks and armored cars with terrifying ease. But the miracle was short-lived. The same mechanical flaws returned, this time worsened by the extreme cold. Fuel thickened, engines struggled to start, and radiators cracked under the freezing temperatures. Tanks that had moved flawlessly on the first day were dead by the third. The roads, clogged with wrecks and ice, became graveyards of steel. The officers tried everything, lighting fires beneath engines to warm them, towing disabled tanks with others that were barely functioning. But the offensive had already begun to falter. The Panther's great strength, its firepower and armor, meant nothing when it couldn't move. The German advance slowed to a crawl, then stopped entirely. In the aftermath, the sight was hauntingly familiar. Burned Panthers lined the Ardennes roads, their hulks half buried in snow. The Allies, advancing again, passed them with curiosity and caution. Some tanks were still pristine, their engines dead but their armor untouched. Machines defeated not by enemy fire, but by time, design, and exhaustion. By early 1945, the officers who had once believed the Panther would save Germany knew the truth beyond denial. The machine had failed its creators. It was a masterpiece built for a war Germany could no longer sustain. It demanded precision, care, and fuel that no longer existed. It was too advanced for a nation now crumbling under bombing raids and starvation. And yet, despite everything, the Panther's reputation remained unbroken. Allied intelligence called it the finest medium tank of the war. Soviet engineers studied captured models with fascination. Even as it failed on the battlefield, it had already shaped the next generation of tanks to come. But for the men who had lived with it, repaired it, and fought inside it, the legend meant nothing. They remembered the smoke-filled cabins, the searing heat of the engine. The moments when a machine meant to save them became a steel coffin. By the war's final winter, the Panther's story was no longer one of triumph or tragedy. It was one of inevitability, the rise and fall of an idea too perfect for the world it was built in. By February 1945, the Panther's days of glory were over. Once a symbol of technological dominance, it now symbolized the slow, grinding collapse of the German war machine. Across the ruined landscapes of Europe, the Panthers that still moved did so on borrowed time. Their engines were tired, their gears stripped, their tracks worn thin. Every movement required fuel that Germany no longer had. Every kilometer forward meant another tank abandoned. Factories that had once produced Panthers with pride now stood silent, buried under rubble from Allied bombing raids. The Maybach engine plant was gone. The complex transmission systems, which had always been a weak point, could no longer be replaced. Mechanics cannibalized parts from wrecks, welding, improvising, performing impossible feats just to keep one or two tanks operational per company. The officers who once boasted of the Panther's precision engineering now cursed it for being too complicated to survive a war of attrition. The reality was cruelly simple. The Panther had been designed for short, decisive battles, the kind Germany no longer fought. It was too heavy for retreat, too fragile for endurance, and too resource-hungry for a nation starving under siege. Yet even in its final months, it remained a weapon that could terrify. Allied tank crews learned to respect its silhouette. The long barrel, the sloped armor, the unmistakable menace of its shape emerging from smoke or snow. When a Panther appeared, it still commanded fear. One good shot from its 75mm gun could destroy almost any Allied tank at range. But those moments of dominance grew rarer with each passing week. The once great armored divisions of the Wehrmacht were now shadows of their former selves. A company might field 5 working Panthers, where once there had been 50. On the Eastern Front, the story was even harsher. The vast plains of Poland and East Prussia were littered with broken machines. Panthers frozen in the snow, half buried in ice, their crews long dead or captured. Soviet forces, advancing relentlessly, bypassed them without pause. The same cold that had crippled so many German operations returned with vengeance, seizing engines and freezing lubricants solid. For all the pride of German engineering, the Panther still could not conquer the elements. In one desperate attempt to hold the Vistula line, a handful of Panthers were sent forward to counterattack a Soviet armored thrust. The tanks moved at dawn, their exhaust clouds rising like ghosts in the winter air. For a brief, shining moment, they achieved what they were built for, striking from range, destroying Soviet armor with precision and speed. The battlefield echoed with the sound of their guns. But as the day wore on, their luck ran out. Engines overheated, transmissions jammed, and one by one, the Panthers fell silent. By dusk, the survivors were forced to retreat and leave behind the very machines that had given them their momentary victory. The officers watched it happen again and again. Brilliance undone by fragility. Every battle told the same story. When the Panther worked, it was magnificent. When it didn't, it was dead weight. And in the final months of the war, Germany could no longer afford magnificence. By March, many Panthers were used as stationary bunkers. Buried hulls turned into immovable gun platforms. Crews manned them from inside frozen shells, waiting for an enemy that never feared them for long. The fuel ran out. The ammunition dwindled. The once proud Panzer divisions became little more than names on paper. Still, the Panther refused to vanish quietly. Even as Berlin burned, reports came of lone tanks fighting to the last shell, engines failing, armor pitted with fire, their crews refusing to surrender. These were not victories, but gestures of defiance, symbols of a dying army clinging to pride in the face of inevitable defeat. For the engineers who had created the Panther, there was no joy left in its legacy. They had built a masterpiece, yes, but one that demanded more than a crumbling empire could give. The same brilliance that had inspired awe now stood as a monument to overreach. By the end of winter, the last Panthers rolled no farther. Some were blown apart by their own crews to prevent capture. Others were simply abandoned, engines cold, turrets still pointed toward the horizon. And as the Red Army advanced westward, one thought lingered among those who had seen the Panthers rise and fall, that even perfection, in the wrong time and place, can destroy the very people who create it. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the mighty Panther stood silent across the ruins of Europe. Hundreds of them lay scattered across roadsides, forests, and battlefields. Hulks of steel rusting beneath the rain, engines frozen forever. In some places, they were still beautiful in their symmetry. Long, elegant barrels pointing toward a horizon they would never reach. But their silence spoke louder than any victory parade. The German officers, who had once admired the tank's elegance, now looked upon it with hollow eyes. For all its brilliance, for all its power, the Panther had not saved them. It had devoured precious time, fuel, and manpower. What had been built to restore Germany's dominance had instead hastened its collapse. Yet to those who came after, the Panther became something else. A lesson written in steel. Allied engineers examined the wrecks with a mixture of awe and curiosity. The Americans and British marveled at its sloped armor, its suspension, and its balance between firepower and speed. The Soviets, too, studied it closely, integrating many of its design features into future tanks like the T-54. In its failure, the Panther had unknowingly laid the foundation for the next generation of armored warfare. Its design was decades ahead of its time. The precision of its mechanics, the shaping of its armor, the reach of its gun, all unmatched in 1943. But war does not reward beauty or complexity. It rewards endurance, simplicity, and reliability. The Panther had been built like a thoroughbred in a world that demanded workhorses. It was a machine that demanded perfection from men and materials that no longer existed. In the post-war years, surviving Panthers were scattered among nations, rebuilding their armies. France kept a few, using them for testing. Czechoslovakia experimented with captured models before scrapping them. In museums, they became icons, reminders of both genius and arrogance. Visitors stood before their towering frames, imagining what it must have felt like to command one, to hear the roar of the Maybach engine and feel its tremor through the steel hull. But few realized that for those who lived with it, the sound was more fear than glory. In the quiet aftermath of war, German engineers reflected on what had gone wrong. They spoke of rushed production, poor logistics, the impossibility of maintaining a machine of such complexity in the chaos of total war. But privately, they admitted another truth, that the Panther had been a dream too ambitious for the dying Reich to sustain. It was built to win a war Germany had already lost in spirit, long before its tanks began to burn. And so, as the years passed, the Panther's image became part of the mythology of World War II, both admired and pitied. To historians, it stood as a symbol of what happens when innovation is chained to desperation. To soldiers who had faced it, it was remembered as a terrifying enemy, but one whose weakness was always hidden just beneath its armor. Today, when one sees a restored Panther in a museum or rolling at a reenactment, it's hard not to feel the contradiction it embodies. It is a masterpiece of engineering, powerful, sleek, and intimidating. Yet it represents one of history's greatest miscalculations. Because in the end, it was not the strongest or the most advanced machines that won the war, but the ones that could endure, the Shermans, the T-34s, the Churchills. The Panther was magnificent, yes, but fragile. It burned bright and fast, like a comet across the dark sky of Europe, and then it was gone. The engineers who once laughed at its power now understood its tragedy. The Panther had not been defeated by the enemy. It had been defeated by the very perfection that made it extraordinary. And as the last of them rusted away in the fields where they had fallen, only one truth remained. Brilliance without endurance is just another kind of failure. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.